Assalamualaikum and a very good evening to Madam Rosia and fellow friends. We hope you are doing well. So my group will be present about types of diplomacy, the United States and China in implementing their nuclear and economic diplomacy. And this presentation will be led by me, Nurmaisar Hazikah Minti Barusni 278199, Ardian Arya Damasulisto 284169, and Diana Patricia Binti Abdullah 285272. So here is the report outline. We will first discuss in what is diplomacy, types of diplomacy which have 8 overall, case study United States and China in implementing the nuclear and economic diplomacy, as well as the conclusion. Therefore, without wasting any time, let's begin. So what is diplomacy? According to a US journalist, diplomacy is the only option to settle Russia's conflict with Ukraine. Perhaps communication will alleviate some of the stress. Diplomacy is commonly seen as a viable option for war, and conflict as a burden to diplomacy. So what does diplomacy imply? Diplomacy is the process of reaching an agreement involving nations that need to work together to achieve goals from which both parties have benefits. However, diplomacy is non-confrontational cooperation to achieve mutual aims. State violence may be used in diplomacy to compel members to accept or reject treaties. Following that, diplomatic norms and rituals are subsets of international politics. Public relations and democracy have transformed diplomacy from rulers' hidden sway to local foreign policy. Lastly, we believe state, international, and commercial entities practice modern diplomacy. Diplomacy is global. Time, place, and problem determine which diplomatic style to choose. For instance, track 1 and 2, nuclear, summit, multilateral, shuttle, public, and economic diplomacy. Next. Now, I welcome Aryan to explain the first type of diplomacy, which are track 1 and 2 diplomacies.
Hello, Assalamualaikum. My name is Arya, and I'm going to be explaining track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. Track 1 diplomacy has a long history in diplomacy and is considered to be the official diplomacy. The distinguishing part of track 1 is the usage is at the state-to-state level. The actors involved in track 1 diplomacy are diplomats, senior government officials, and the head of state. There are several advantages to track 1 diplomacy, which include the ability to use political influence towards negotiations, access to material and monetary resources, vast intelligence over the parties' interests, experienced and qualified negotiators. Also, there are downsides to the track 1 diplomacy, which are the methods used sometimes to politically influence, the diplomatic missions, usually closes when international hostilities rises, and the officials conducting the negotiations are limited in their freedoms of speech. The next one is track 2 diplomacy, which is regarded as the unofficial diplomacy. The advantages of track 2 diplomacy are negotiators can voice their opinion more freely because they are not bound by politics. The resolution to the dispute are more suitable because the negotiators can better voice their opinion based on their own backgrounds. Track 2 diplomacy is also very good at preventing pre- and post-conflict throughout the negotiations. The political cycles do not have any impact on track 2 diplomacy. Although there are many advantages to track 2 diplomacy, there are also disadvantages such as the lack of power and influence of track 2 diplomacy and the little impact on the foreign policy, the inability to effectively handle war conflict, the lack of resources, and it is also ineffective in an authoritarian system.
Next types are preventive diplomacy. Preventive diplomacy is a concept used to prevent conflicts from worsening, restrict their spread, and prevent them from becoming international crises. Indeed, may help be one of the most innovative contributions in the United Nations system for the restorations of peace and international security. The question here is how preventive diplomacy for peace and security came to be. DAC, the United Nations Secretary General from 1953 to 1961, was the first to advocate for preventive diplomacy. He regards the United Nations as a critical arena for ensuring global security and safety. Preventive diplomacy has evolved while maintaining the same basics. To put it another way, United Nations Preventive Deployment Force (UNPREDEP) in Macedonia from 1995 to 1999 is an example of preventive diplomacy. There was a lesson learned from this operation. Preventive diplomacy may be an effective kind of peacekeeping even with a small, seemingly figurative deployment of UN troops, as long as it has died at the right time and with a well-defined aims. A report from the Secretary General to the Security Council in November 1995, said that the mission's core objective, preventive violence in the former Yugoslavia from spreading, had been achieved. In short, international law, notably the protections of human rights, places a high priority on the role of preventive diplomacy in such circumstances. It is clear that the United Nations, as the world's most important institution, should fulfill its original missions of ensuring global peace and security as developed by the notions of preventive diplomacy.
Hi, my name is Diana Batusha binti Abdullah, matrix number 285272, and I'm going to explain about the nuclear diplomacy. Nuclear diplomacy is the avoidance of nuclear conflict and the limiting of nuclear proliferation during times of peace. With the emergence of nuclear powers, it means exercising influence by the UN Security Council, NSG, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. Next is summit diplomacy. Summit diplomacy is a subset of conference diplomacy that is utilized by different governments around the world during in-person meetings of the head of state. Usually, these meetings are from the highest level of state and international organizations. The meetings will usually impact big on the worldwide environment. For example, the latest summit will done by G7 leaders in Bavarian Alps. The G7 leaders are Canada, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, UK, and US. Next is the multilateral diplomacy. Multilateral diplomacy is when 3 or more countries work together to reach the same goal. Multilateralism promotes global governance by the many and rejects discriminatory bilateral agreements. Classical diplomacy focuses on interstate contacts. Non-state actors and new forms of diplomacy influenced by globalization and the digitalization of information have received more attention in recent years. The 21st century presents new difficulties for multilateral diplomacy, necessitating changes to international institutions and global governance. Next is the shuttle diplomacy. Shuttle diplomacy is the practice of sending diplomats from one country to another in effort to mediate a dispute between two nations whose respective heads of state refuse to communicate with one another in person. Shuttle diplomacy is a new development in international relations made feasible by contemporary communication technology and air travel, which allow a mediator to quickly fly between negotiating sides. For example, shuttle diplomacy once emerged at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 when Italy briefly withdrew from the conference in protest of other international delegations' refusal to grant its irredentist territorial claims promised by the Treaty of London in 1950.
Government may communicate with the public of other nations to better understand their needs, values, practices, and interests. Public diplomacy is one of these ways. Public diplomacy differs from conventional diplomacy in that it still involves managing international affairs via the participations of governments and, in most cases, diplomatic departments. Conventional diplomacy frequently necessitates a level of secrecy of seclusions that cannot be ignored. However, public diplomacy is almost always a transparent process, much like nature itself. Its primary goal is to get people to notice and understand what it is all about. Because of this, public diplomacy was divided into two, which are: the first stage is to improve the government's reputations, branding, and cultural communication. As for the second stage is to employ faster acting strategies. As for the first stage example, America employed public diplomacy to convince Europeans that democracy and capitalism were preferable to Soviet alternative during the Cold War. Inside the Soviet Union, Voice of America, or VOA, transmitted to challenge Western perceptions, While this was going, the US Department of State set up maintain reading rooms for allies across the world. American ideals and values were seen by the CIA as a way to get more support for US initiative. As for the next stage example, Kuwait attempted to gain popular support for an attack on Iraq in 1990 by courting American citizens. Kuwait engaged an American public relations (PR) agency to persuade American voters that Saddam Hussein's departure from office was ethically right. The majority of voters had never heard of Kuwait and had varying views of the country's role. George Bush believed that if he attempted to attack Iraq, he would not have the support of the American people. Kuwait made a determined effort to expose Saddam Hussein's harshness and elicits American sympathy. As a result, we can see that in order to keep public peace, public diplomacy perform an important role that is frequently overlooked. So it is now time to take a look at the last type of diplomacy, which are economic diplomacy. Enhancing development has been the principal focus for nations in most countries throughout the world when it comes to economic diplomacy, which deals with national economic challenges. So both economic diplomacy also can be described as any diplomatic activity used to further a state economic interest. As well, diplomacy helps to utilize economic resources to attain a foreign policy. The European Union, in particular, dominates international economic diplomacy. It has a significant effect on global economic diplomacy due to its importance as the country's main trade partner. The EU participates in economic diplomacy via a variety of skills, procedures, instruments, and these sections discuss trade treaties, World Trade Organization (WTO), sanctions, and financial and monetary constraints. Briefly, a nation's goals are furthered via the use of economic diplomacy as the consequence of globalization. Non-state actors today have a massive impact on economic diplomacy over governments. Rivalry arises from extensive actor relationships. To further their national interests, countries must rewrite economic diplomacy lines that have been built by third parties. That's all from me. So let's moving on to the case study.
United States usage of the atomic diplomacy is based around their nuclear hegemony. It is usually filled with threats of nuclear weaponry against opposing states. However, the effectiveness of nuclear diplomacy was short-lived because other nations soon developed their own nuclear weaponry after World War II. The main reasoning between the decrease in nuclear diplomacy's effectiveness is that the nations that uses it realize the damage of atomic weaponry is not worth the result. Examples of the usage is when the US sent B-29 bombers capable of carrying nuclear bombs to Berlin when the Berlin blockade happened. China's economic diplomacy can be seen in their massive foreign direct investments made in developing countries, where China helped the developing countries' economical and infrastructural growth by injecting a huge amount of money in that country. One of the biggest receivers of this is Indonesia, which many of its infrastructural developments made in recent years are possible because of investments made by China. Examples are the building of the Tanjung Port in northern Sumatra and Bitung Port in northern Sulawesi, which aims to improve Indonesia's sea infrastructure and logistic activity. Summary of this project is to show how to make diplomacy more effective in furthering the interests of the nation or organization through various types of diplomacy, and how to use these various types of diplomacy to promote more peaceful resolution to conflict.